Continuing my series looking at World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, it's now time to take a look at British World War II tanks. And like with the Germans, I will be just covering the British tanks in this episode, with British armoured cars, tank destroyers, SPGs, and anti-air vehicles to be covered at a later date. As to be expected from a nation that was involved in World War II from the very start, Britain developed and fielded a large number of tanks. But bizarrely, even standard British tanks that served in large numbers are still missing from War Thunder, giving us a large number of tanks to look at. However, the tanks that still need adding are rather lopsided, with most of these coming from the cruiser tanks that Britain deployed. These essentially being the fast, medium sort of tanks that were to exploit breakthroughs, while the tanks that were created to make those breakthroughs, the slower, more heavily armoured infantry tanks, are generally well represented in War Thunder. With that in mind, we'll start off by looking at the British cruiser tanks, or more specifically the Cruiser Mark I A9, the first of the British cruiser tanks to enter service with the British Army. And this was a 1936 design which came about from a requirement for a tank with a 3-man turret and to be armed with the 47mm 3-pounder gun. The design was originally going to be called the Medium Tank Mark IV, and heavily resembles the larger Vickers Medium Tank Mark III design, including the 2 front-mounted machine gun turrets. But the main armament fitted ended up being the excellent 40mm 2-pounder gun, which was one of the best tank guns of the time, and far superior to the 3-pounder, being capable in game of penetrating 52mm of armour at 500 metres with its stock AP round, while a coaxial machine gun was also carried alongside the 2 machine gun turrets. Speed was decent enough, maxing out at 25 mph or 40 km/h from a 150 horsepower AEC petrol bus engine. So not quite as fast as the current starting British A13 cruiser tank, but only by 5 mph, so this tank should have no trouble getting around the battlefield. Unfortunately, its armour does severely let it down, maxing out at only 14mm, enough to stop small caliber machine gun fire but not much else, making this easy prey for virtually any vehicle that gets the drop on it, while the fact it uses riveted rather than cast or welded armour could cause additional spalling when hit in real life. However, the large crew count does give some redundancy for crew losses, with a total of 6 crew, the 2 machine gunners in the frontal turrets, a driver in the hull, and 3 in the main turret. In game, I could see this working at 1.0, perhaps as the new starting cruiser tank, replacing the A13. As this has the same gun, a larger crew, and the same maximum armour while being marginally slower, and while not the best tank in the world, it would be nice to see the first British cruiser tank available in War Thunder. In real life, only 125 were built, being seen as a cheap stopgap tank until more effective designs could be produced, with the first A9 seeing combat in the Battle of France, attempting to halt the Germans or break the encirclement of Allied forces in northern France. But they suffered horrendous losses for very little gain. They would see further service in Greece, where all of the A9s committed would be lost, but also in North Africa, where they would see some limited success against the Italians, but by the summer of 1941 they had been withdrawn from combat, and any survivors relegated to training tanks. The A9 design would quickly be followed by the cruiser tank A10, and this was actually designed as an infantry tank, being based on the A9 design but with much thicker armour. Interestingly, the prototype of the A10, the A10E1, was a radically different design to the production version, being fitted with sloped armour, in theory providing much greater protection for the tank. Unfortunately, this was reverted to a more standard flat front due to a requirement to fit a hull machine gun on the right side of the hull, somewhat weakening the protection for very little gain. As for the armour itself, it now maxes out at 30mm, a welcome improvement over the A9's 14mm, though this was done by attaching additional plates to the existing armour plates, which in real life doesn't provide as much protection as one 30mm plate does, but this wouldn't cause any difference in game, and like with the A9, the armour is riveted. The main armament is once again the excellent 40mm 2-pounder gun, while a machine gun is carried in the coaxial position and another in the bow, though in some cases the bow machine gun position is plated off, but otherwise this tank is pretty well armed against enemy tanks and soft skin vehicles. Mobility is worse than the A9, with the same 150 horsepower AEC petrol bus engine giving the 14.3 tonne tank a top speed of 16 miles per hour or 26 kilometers an hour, making this a pretty slow tank in comparison to the other cruiser tanks, though as mentioned this was originally designed as an infantry tank, so that is to be expected. Lastly, the crew is now 5 due to the removal of the machine gun turrets, with 3 crew in the turret and the machine gunner and driver in the hull. Though interestingly, due to the machine gunner's placement on the right side of the hull, the driver is placed on the left, which is a rather unusual arrangement for British tanks. In-game I could see this being folded with the A9, or even being the starting tank in the infantry line, probably at 1.0, as this still has a great main gun and good crew complement, but the slower speed will let it down a little bit, and while the armour is now improved, it would still be fairly easy to defeat for most enemy tanks. In real life, 175 of these would be built, and as mentioned it had been intended to serve as an infantry tank, but the requirements for an infantry tank now required them to have much heavier armour than 30mm, so the A10 would be redesignated as a heavy cruiser tank, though 30mm of armour would become the standard for most cruiser tanks in the future anyway. Much like the A9, the A10 would see service in France and Greece, where they would suffer great losses in combat, but they would also serve in North Africa, where they would see far more success. But by the end of 1941, these were no longer used in combat. It should be noted that both the A9 and A10 had close support variants that were armed with what is called a 3.7-inch or 94mm howitzer, but it is actually a breech-loaded mortar and is only capable of firing HE and smoke shells. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, the HE shells would have been rather ineffective against tanks, having less than 1 kilogram of high explosive, meaning it would have a lot of trouble defeating most existing tanks, especially those that are already in-game. That said, they might have some limited success against thinner-skinned World War I or interwar tanks, so perhaps they could be added at some point, but currently I think they would struggle too much to consider adding them, and that goes for other close support tanks armed with the same weapon. So the A9 and A10 served in the early part of the war alongside the A13 cruiser tank Mark III and Mark IV, but there was still a desire for a true heavy cruiser tank, which was to become the A16. However, this was looking to be quite expensive, so a new, cheaper design was commissioned instead, this being the cruiser tank Mark V or A13 Mark III, better known as the Covenanter, with 1,771 of these being built, more than the Tiger I. Originally, it was to have a maximum armour thickness of 30mm, but the General Staff increased this to 40mm, increasing the weight of the tank, but now design work could begin in earnest. The Covenanter would be designed by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company, or LMS, who hadn't actually designed or built any tanks before this point. This might seem like an odd choice then, but as British rearmament was well underway, getting various companies tooled up for manufacturing tanks was a necessity, especially if that company was already used to building large machines like trains. Having a company that hasn't designed tanks and going into the process with a fresh mind can also sometimes lead to some rather good designs. For example, Romania's first tank destroyer design, the Marischal, ended up being such a good design that it basically led to the German Jagdpanzer 38T, while many Australian World War II tank designs are to my mind superior to contemporary British ones, despite the fact Australia had never built tanks before World War II. In the case of the Covenanter, this led to a rather well-designed tank, set to make use of aluminium and well-sloped welded armour, improving protection and reducing weight, and it was to use a new more powerful water-cooled engine with a large fan for ventilation. Indeed, the only downside was the fact that the radiator was mounted at the front due to a lack of space in the engine compartment at the rear, meaning pipes would need to be fed through the crew compartment, which could be a problem if the tank engine overheated, but as it was a lightweight design, this should have been something that could have been managed or improved in the future. So with a good design seemingly in hand, and tanks being needed fast, it was ordered into production in April 1939, before a prototype was even built. Eventually, a prototype was built with the welded armour, and in testing in May 1940 proved to be a rather successful tank. Surely a good sign of things to come. Unfortunately, due to factors outside of LMS's control, things quickly started to go wrong. First, the aluminium parts had to be replaced with steel due to the aluminium being needed for aircraft, increasing the weight. Then a shortage of welders forced a return to riveted armour, decrease in the protection and, you guessed it, increase in the weight, bearing in mind it was already reaching its weight limit when the armour was increased to 40mm. To top things off, the engine ventilation fan had to be changed from the large fan of the first prototype to a smaller one, which, combined with the radiator pipes in the crew compartment, caused the engine and crew compartment to overheat. This made the tank unsuitable for combat in anything but temperate or cooler temperatures, which was an issue when the fighting shifted to North Africa. But the Covenanter could of course still be added to War Thunder, as these factors wouldn't be represented in game. So looking at its stats, the Covenanter had a top speed of 31 mph or 50 km/h from the 340 horsepower Meadows engine. A pretty decent speed all things considered, while the armour of course now maxes out at 40mm, but instead of being one plate it's actually two, with the inner plate being made of high quality steel and the outer layer of armour plate. Meanwhile, the main armament was the 2-pounder 40mm gun, along with one coaxial machine gun, while the crew was 4, the driver in the hull and the 3 crew in the angled turret. In War Thunder I could see the initial prototype and production versions being added at 2.7 to 3.0, with these being able to quickly get around the battlefield, deal with most enemy tanks and be protected from most return fire, and they would be rather interesting tanks to have in game. In real life, due to its various issues, the Covenanter was never used as a combat tank, though a few would be sent to North Africa for trials, and others would be converted to bridge layers and used by various allied armies. The rest, however, would remain in the UK, mainly used as training tanks, where they would give good service in this role, with one actually being destroyed by German aircraft at some point in the southeast of England. They were also doing a good job of just being available in the event of a German invasion. After all, the temperature issues would matter less as Britain is far cooler than the North African desert, and these tanks would be on their own turf and near their own factories for quick repair and access to spare parts, and of course were around in large numbers, making them a deadly threat to any German force. However, with 1,771 Covenanters being built and kept in production until 1943, it does seem like production should have been curtailed far earlier, and while it did have that success as a training tank, it was overall a failed tank design. After the Covenanter, we have the A-15 Cruiser Tank Mark VI, more commonly known as the Crusader, and we already have the Mark II and Mark III variants of this tank in War Thunder, but we could of course still get the initial Mark I. Now I thought looking at the Mark I was going to be quite easy to deal with, as the Crusader Mark I is just a Mark II with less armour. Or more specifically, the turret front should have 10mm less armour, the turret top and side plates 3 to 4mm less armour, and 6mm less for the nose. Unfortunately, it seems like the Crusaders already in game have the wrong armour thickness, because while in real life they used composite armour like on the Covenanter, in game it often seems to only have the outer layer modelled. This isn't always the case, as the side armour is modelled correctly, but it seems the whole front and rear only have the outer layer modelled. In-game, the Mark I could go at 2.3, filling the battle rating gap between the A-13 Mark II and the Crusader Mark II, with the Mark I having a good gun and mobility, and while now a little bit more vulnerable, it is not drastically so, and I could see it having some success in-game, while the Mark II and III should have their armour thicknesses corrected, improving their capabilities in-game. There is also a test bed of the Crusader that could be added, this having been used to test the new Meteor engine that would later be used on the Cromwell tank, with the original Crusader engine having a top speed of 26 mph or 32 km/h on a 350 horsepower Liberty engine, while in testing the two Crusaders fitted with the 600 horsepower Meteor engine could achieve speeds of at least just over 50 mph. Unfortunately, we don't have an exact top speed as this wasn't measured very accurately in testing, but either way the top speed has now at least been doubled, making this one of the fastest tanks that could be added to the game. The armament would be the 40mm 2-pounder gun and all of the other stats would remain the same. And in game I could see this being added as an event vehicle at around 2.7 to 3.3, with the massive speed increase making this perfect for getting around the map and escaping from bad situations, as well as getting to cap points early in the match. In real life, Crusaders of all types would be built and serve in the North African campaign, but once the campaign was over, due to various issues with the design, these were generally converted to other roles, such as self-propelled anti-aircraft tanks or artillery tractors. So the Crusader became the preeminent cruiser tank of the British Army in North Africa, but even as the first of these were coming off the production lines, development was well underway on yet another cruiser tank, this time taking into account the lessons learnt in the fighting in France, namely that the frontal armour should be up to 75mm thick, and a larger turret ring should be installed so that a larger gun could be fitted. In January 1941, Lord Nuffield's company, Nuffield Mechanisations and Aero, had their design for this new tank chosen, with a requirement for production to start in the spring of 1942. This tank was originally called the Cruiser Tank Mark 7 or A24 Cromwell, but due to later developments that we'll get into, it would be redesignated as Cavalier, and it was to reuse components from existing tanks like the Crusader, allowing for the design to be ordered into production without any prototypes yet being constructed. The Cavalier, as you can see, looks very similar, but not identical to the Cromwell, and it was to be armed with the excellent 57mm 6-pounder gun, giving an in-game penetration of 82mm at 500 metres with its stock AP round, making this a very good anti-tank weapon, while a coaxial and bow machine gun were also carried. Armour is actually better than the Cromwell, coming in at 76mm versus the Cromwell's 64mm, making this a better armoured tank by comparison, though this protection is reduced due to the flat nature of many of the armour plates, especially around the turret. Speed is also not the best, with its 410 horsepower Mark IV Nuffield Liberty engine giving a top speed of 24 miles per hour or 39 kilometers an hour. Certainly not the slowest tank in the world, but hardly the fastest either, and is much slower than the later Cromwell 1, while the crew carried was 5, a driver and machine gunner in the hull and the rest placed in the turret. The Cavalier could work at a battle rating 3.7, as despite being far slower than the Cromwell 1, it does have better protection and is still armed with the same excellent 57mm gun, allowing this lesser known tank to have some success in War Thunder. In real life, the Cavalier project would be hit with delays, and by the time things got rolling again, it would be dealt a mortal blow as a partnership between Leyland Motors and Rolls-Royce had resulted in the latter modifying its V12 Merlin aircraft engine into the 600 horsepower Meteor engine, which in testing would prove to be a far better engine than the Liberty, and would result in the famous Cromwell tank design. The new engine made the Cavalier the clearly inferior tank, so you would think they would redesign the tank to take the Meteor engine. Well, unfortunately Lord Nuffield was completely unwilling to do this, sticking with the Liberty engine. Despite this, the government didn't overrule him, and so despite being an inferior tank, 500 Cavaliers would still be produced. 160 as gun tanks, 12 of these being given to France in 1945, and the remaining 340 were built as observation post tanks, making this yet another failed tank design that was still produced in significant numbers, yet not redeeming itself in an important secondary role like the Covenanter, and like that tank it never saw any combat service. So despite some hiccups in getting there, Britain now had a good cruiser tank in the form of the Cromwell now ready to go into production and to replace the Crusader. Unfortunately, things now took an odd turn. Basically, Leyland, who had spurred the development of the Meteor in the first place, now got cold feet about the Meteor engine, worrying that there wouldn't be adequate cooling for the new engine, and subsequently left the project. Eventually a compromise was made where the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, or BRC&W, would take over production of the now A27M Cromwell with its Meteor engine, while Leyland would build the A27L Centaur with the Liberty engine, this being a similar tank to the Cromwell but fitted with the now Mark V 410 horsepower Liberty engine. Thankfully some common sense prevailed as they were designed to take the Meteor engine at a later date. The Liberty engine gave a top speed of 24 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour, again far slower than the Cromwell tank, while still having a 5-man crew, maximum armour of 76mm, and it was armed usually with either a 57mm 6-pounder gun or the quick-firing 75mm gun, as well as 2 machine guns. However, some were fitted with a 95mm howitzer, which carried a heat round capable of penetrating 110mm of armour, which would be an interesting variant to have in game. This could probably be added to the main tech tree at 3.3, possibly even folded with the Cavalier and maybe even some variants as event vehicles, depending on which gun is used. And while it would be nice for this tank to be included, I don't think it will play too differently to the Cavalier, except for the howitzer versions. In real life, the Centaur was more of a stopgap tank until enough Cromwells were produced, which thankfully was achieved before D-Day, so production was cut back. Although exact production numbers are a little bit difficult to get a hold of, I've seen figures anywhere from 950 to 1,821, because of course a lot of them were converted to take the Meteor engine. However, a number of those fitted with the 95mm howitzers did see combat with the Royal Marines during the Normandy invasion and fighting in the subsequent weeks, while 52 Centaurs would be given to Greece in 1946, though these wouldn't see much use due to a lack of trained crew. So having looked at the Cavalier and Centaur, we now come to the Cromwell, which first went into production in January 1942, with 2,492 being built, the vast majority of which were riveted, with 126 being welded. Of course, there are many Cromwell variants, but for the most part these variants are just Centaurs with the Meteor engine fitted, so hardly noteworthy. But there are a few unique Cromwell variants, for example the Cromwell Mark VI, which is a re-engined Centaur armed with the 95mm howitzer, and the rather interesting Cromwell Mark 7W, which is essentially the ultimate version of the Cromwell, being fitted with wider tracks, heavy-duty front axles, and a welded hull with a maximum armour of 101mm, making this far better protected than current Cromwell tanks and better at going cross-country. And this could be added at 4.0 to 4.3, while the Mark 8 is a Centaur 1 or 3 with thicker frontal armour and the 95mm howitzer fitted. So the Cromwell did turn out to be a decent tank, especially with the Meteor engine. But what had been a decent design in 1942 was a bit outdated by 1943 when the first units in the UK started receiving their first Cromwells, and was seriously outclassed when first sent into combat in June 1944 during the invasion of Normandy. If it had managed to actually get into combat in 1943, I think the tank would have done far better. Luckily, an improved cruiser tank was soon available, this being the A34 Comet, which had begun development in 1943 and entered service in January 1945, barely 6 months after the Cromwell, which kind of goes to show that even people at the time knew that the Cromwell was going to need replacing pretty quickly. And this was essentially an improved Cromwell with a new turret with a 77mm high-velocity gun, which is actually just a shorter 76.2mm 17-pounder gun, but this is still a massive improvement over the quick-firing 75mm gun. Only 2 variants of these would be made, the Type A and B. The Type A is already in-game, while the B's only real difference is the use of twin fishtail exhaust pipes at the rear. However, in addition to its turret-mounted smoke dischargers, the Comet also had a smoke discharging system at the rear of the tank that the driver could operate, but these are missing in-game, so adding these would help improve the survivability of the Comet somewhat. So finally, after much development and hardship, Britain had a good cruiser tank in service. However, the Comet was itself to only really be a stopgap tank, quickly being overshadowed by a new tank, the A41 Heavy Cruiser Tank, better known as Centurion. Of course, this tank is famous for its use in the Cold War, but it was developed in World War II, with the specifications being laid out in February 1944, and the first prototypes were built in early 1945, so it does qualify for this video. This time, instead of no prototypes being made, a number of pilot models were made, 16 in fact, though some were made out of soft steel, and these did so well in testing that 6 were sent to Europe in May 1945, this deployment being named Operation Sentry. This was after the Germans had surrendered, but would give some data on how they would perform when deployed in what had very recently been a combat theatre. One of the big differences between these pilot models and the production versions is the weaker armour, coming in at 57mm for the frontal glacis, versus 76.2mm for the production version, making this far more vulnerable to enemies than the Mark I. Armament was also slightly different, with the last prototype to be built being fitted with the 77mm H3 gun from the Comet, which again is technically just a 76.2mm 17-pounder with a shorter barrel, which again makes this a slightly worse performing weapon than the regular 17-pounder. For the rest of the pilots, 14 of these were to be armed with the 17-pounder gun, but instead of a coaxial machine gun, they had 20mm Polston cannons, the same as used on the Skink anti-air vehicle, and these can fire either HE or AP rounds with an in-game penetration of 23mm at 500 metres, making these lethal against soft-skin vehicles and a minor threat to some armoured ones. These cannons might prove useful in-game, but were not well liked in real life, with a regular machine gun being preferred instead, though only one of the prototypes had a machine gun fitted. There was also an idea of mounting a machine gun on the rear of some of these tanks, but this was thankfully dropped pretty quickly as it interfered with the 2-inch bomb thrower which was used for launching smoke rounds. Lastly, one of the prototypes was fitted with a Sinclair Meadows Powerflow gearbox with 4 forward gears and 3 reverse gears, giving an improved reverse speed of 14 miles per hour or 22.5 kilometers an hour, compared to the reverse speed of 8 miles per hour on the Mark I, but this was ultimately only tested on one vehicle. I could see the 77mm variant being added at 5.3 to 5.7, as it has a weaker gun and armour compared to the Centurion Mark I, while the variants with the 17-pounder could be added at 5.7, as these tanks would still have the worse armour but better guns, while the 20mm Polston cannon would be a unique feature of this tank, and it would be nice for players to experience these unique pilot models of what would become the world-beating Centurion tank. In real life, these pilots would do very well in testing, with various minor issues being found and fixed, but for the most part these performed very well, and the Centurion would go into production in November 1945, though with wider tracks and 76.2mm frontal armour, and it would go on to become the premier British tank of the early Cold War period. So that is all of the British cruiser tanks, which brings us to the infantry tanks. And as mentioned at the beginning, nearly all of the infantry tanks are already represented in-game. And to my mind, these do seem to represent the more successful British tank designs, at least with regards to their development not being a total nightmare. However, before we take a look at the main infantry tank designs, I want to take a look at the various heavy tank designs that didn't make it into service. These being the A-20 heavy tank, the Valiant, and the TOG-2's less famous predecessor, the TOG-1. So we'll start off with the A-20, also known as the A-20 Shelled Area Tank, which makes sense considering it was expected to operate in battlefields reminiscent to those of World War I, but was also bizarrely known for some reason by the French-sounding A-20 Char de Fortress. This began development on the 1st of September 1939, with Harland and Wolff leading the effort and Vauxhall Motors helping. The design specifications envisioned operating in World War I style battlefields, so filled with trenches and shell craters in muddy conditions. As a result, the A-20 does somewhat resemble World War I tanks, with its track running all around the hull. Other specifications were also somewhat archaic, with an unditching beam to be carried, eliminating the possibility of having a turret, while the main armament was to be carried in side-mounted sponsons. Luckily, the requirement for an unditching beam was ignored, and a Matilda turret was fitted, which was to carry the 40mm 2-pounder gun, while the sponsons themselves were also eliminated. However, a weapon was to be mounted at the front of the tank, but it took a while to decide what weapon that was going to be, as it was originally intended to be a 57mm 6-pounder gun, then a cut-down 6-pounder, then various British 3-inch and 3.7-inch guns, and a French 75mm howitzer were all suggested and rejected, before finally it was decided that a 2-pounder gun was to be fitted. This would give good firepower for the front, allowing the tank to essentially cover 2 areas at the same time, though it seems unlikely that the weapons were actually fitted to the prototype. In addition, 3 machine guns were to be carried, 1 in the turret and 1 on each side of the tank, with a 90-degree angle of fire along the sides. The armour was pretty good, being 60mm thick for the whole front, while the Matilda turret would be 75mm thick all round, meaning you could park behind cover and allow only the well-protected turret to take fire, while still being pretty well protected if caught in the open, though I'm sure the side and rear armour would be less well protected, and the tracks are completely exposed, thus vulnerable to enemy attempts to detrack you. For the engine, while Harland and Wolff hoped to fit one of their diesel engines, this wasn't ready in time, so a Meadows DAV was to be fitted instead, as despite fears it would be underpowered, it was at least available. However, Vauxhall, who had been designing the suspension and presumably had done a pretty good job of it, was then asked to fit their Bedford Twin 6 engine, which was essentially a pair of lorry engines combined, though there's some confusion on which prototype received which engine. Either way, the 40-ton A20 had a top speed of only 10 miles per hour or 16 kilometers an hour, making this a very slow tank and likely painful to use getting across the map, though an unditching tower is fitted to help cross trenches, and lastly a crew of 7 was to be carried, 3 in the turret and the rest in the hull. I could see the A20 working at around 2.3, having a pretty good armament and being well protected, with a large crew to boot. But its slow speed will make it easy to outflank, and it will quickly be left behind by other tanks, meaning you would have to be slow and methodical when using this tank. Ultimately, 2 prototypes would be built of mild steel in Northern Ireland in early 1940 by Harland and Wolff, and immediately problems cropped up, with the Royal Engineers saying the 40-ton tank was too heavy for their bridges, and then it turned out to be too tall for the railways. So when sent to Vauxhall in Bedfordshire, the turret had to remain in Northern Ireland, which wasn't too bad as Harland and Wolff were making Matildas, so it was just used on a regular tank. However, the killing blow was the invasion of France, which showed that the sort of trench warfare it was designed for wasn't going to happen. The A20 that Vauxhall received would be tested for a short time, but in June 1940 the project would be cancelled, with Vauxhall's A20 being relegated to ballast when testing various tank transporters. However, Vauxhall's time on the A20 was not wasted, as they would be given the task of designing its successor, the A22 or Churchill tank, which would carry over many of the A20's design features, allowing the A20 to live on in a sense. Of course, the A20 wasn't the only heavy tank being designed in the early war period, as the TOG-1 was also being developed at this time. To give a quick background on its design, Albert Stern, who had headed the Land Ship Committee in World War I, which had designed Britain's first tanks in that war, had been invited to head up the Special Vehicle Development Committee, or SVDC, for designing a new tank. In aid of this, he invited many of his old colleagues from the Land Ship Committee to join the SVDC, and they soon got the nickname the Old Gang, or TOG. Now, getting all of the people involved in the original tank development program wasn't necessarily the worst idea, as they already had experience with tanks, and now had an additional 20 odd years of experience on top of that, especially useful for those who were experts in engines or armament, for example. It also wasn't just designed with World War I fighting in mind, as of course there was the need for a heavy tank that would be capable of breaching heavy defences along the Siegfried Line during any Allied offensive into Germany. The TOC committee would work fast on their design, and by December 1939 a design was set out along with a wooden mock-up, and 2 prototypes would be ordered, the TOG-1 and TOG-2. The TOG-1 and 2 were to be built by William Foster & Co., the same company that had built many of Britain's tanks in World War I, with a delivery date for the TOG-1 of October 1940, and for tests to commence in November 1940. The resulting tank was heavily armed, with a French 75mm howitzer and mounting from the Char B1 bis fitted at the front, this having been brought back from a visit to France in 1939, and this is capable of penetrating 50mm at 500 metres, though originally the more powerful Model 1897 was to be carried. It was also originally intended to carry the 2 40mm 2-pounder guns in sponsons on either side of the tank, but thankfully a Matilda turret was fitted instead, removing the need for the guns to be mounted on the sides. The sponsons themselves were still intended to be fitted and armed with 2 Bisa machine guns each, but they don't appear to have ever been fitted to the tank. Armour was also pretty good, being 76.2mm all round, similar to the KV-1, making this a very well protected tank, though its unprotected tracks will make a very obvious target that can quickly be destroyed. When it comes to the mobility, the TOG-1 is rather similar to the later TOG-2, in that it is powered by a diesel-electric drive, where the diesel engine powers a generator that in turn powers 2 electric motors to turn the tracks. This allows it to have a top speed of just under 9 miles per hour or 14 kilometers an hour when going forward or in reverse. Not particularly quick, but at least gives it a decent reverse speed to escape ambushes. However, due to the issues with the electric drive, a hydraulic drive would later be added, which could be represented as another variant or even as a modification in-game. Due to its 10.5 metre length, it was also able to cross 4.5 metre wide trenches, as well as climb various obstacles, allowing it to quickly get around the battlefield and defeat any obstacles that it encounters. Lastly, it was to have a crew of 8 when fitted with sponsons, but I suspect it would have a crew of 5 to 6 without them. I could see this being added at around 3.0 to 3.3, having a good mixed armament, decent armour and good crew count, only really being let down by its slow speed, but players used to the TOG-2 should be able to work around this. Ultimately, the TOG-1 wouldn't be complete until October 1940, with the first tests in November 1940, where it was quickly found that the steering was difficult due to its length, and the electrical drive was prone to overheating, which eventually resulted in a fire, and a conversion to a hydraulic drive system, becoming the TOG-1A. However, this wasn't done until 1943 and still issues persisted, so the TOG-1 was sent to Chobham in 1944 and seems to have been used as a test bed before being scrapped. So ultimately, while this was a fairly decent assault tank and had some novel features, I struggle to see why it was kept around as anything more than a test bed, especially after May 1940, when the Germans had literally shown that going around a big defensive line was a valid strategy, and much better tanks for assaulting heavy positions were now around in large numbers. And so I feel the TOG committee, while creating a pretty decent design for attacking fortified positions, could have been better used improving existing tanks over working on such a large behemoth as the TOG. So we're almost onto the regular infantry tanks, but there is one more heavy tank we need to look at, the A38 Valiant, often considered one of the worst tanks of World War II. Basically, this was an infantry assault tank that was intended to be used in the Far East against Japan, with an emphasis on heavy armour while also being as light as possible and having a 3-man turret. The design specification was technically met, weighing in at 27 tonnes while having a maximum of 114mm of armour, but it did lead to some compromises, with the hull being rather narrow and the turret so large that the turret ring sticks out of the side of the hull, hardly an ideal situation, while the driver position was incredibly cramped. That said, the turret did have a decent armament, being fitted with the quick-firing 75mm gun, though its fault a 57mm 6-pounder gun was initially fitted, the latter weapon having better armour penetration, so perhaps we could have the option of which gun to bring, while a coaxial machine gun was also carried. Despite the weight being reduced as much as possible, the 27-ton tank only has a top speed of 12 miles per hour or 19 kilometers an hour, which wasn't a problem in real life as it was intended to operate with infantry, but could be an issue in-game, while a crew of 4 was also to be carried, 3 in the turret and the driver in the hull. So overall, while not an ideal tank, it doesn't sound absolutely horrible, so why is it considered one of the worst tanks of World War II? Well, it's basically to do with factors that wouldn't have any effect in War Thunder, but would be rather dangerous in real life, and were mainly to do with the driving compartment and its controls. For example, switching out of 5th gear resulted in the gear lever coming back so fast it almost broke the driver's wrist, while operating the brake theoretically had a risk of the driver's foot getting stuck and the foot needing to be amputated in order to get the driver out. So as you can see, that is a bit of a disaster. However, like I said, those factors wouldn't affect it in War Thunder, and I could see it being added in-game at maybe 4.3 to 4.7, depending on what gun it is fitted with, and I could see this working like a slower Excelsior or Churchill Mark 7, and while not a particularly good tank in real life, it would be nice to see it in War Thunder. In real life, this tank was tested in 1944, but due to the aforementioned issues, the tests were abandoned early for safety reasons, and while it might have been possible to fix these issues, with the end of the war it was decided to cancel the project, but the prototype was kept as a warning to future would-be tank designers. So that is the various prototype heavy tanks that never made it into service, which brings us to the regular infantry tanks that still need adding to War Thunder. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have nearly all major infantry tank types, but we don't have the original infantry tank design, the Matilda 1A11, and there is a very good reason that it hasn't, and in my opinion shouldn't, be added. As well, an interesting tank with a top speed of 8 miles per hour or 13 kilometers an hour, a 2-man crew and maximum of 60mm of armour, it is unfortunately only armed with a 303 or 50 caliber machine gun, with the latter having a maximum penetration of 10mm at 90 meters. Thus, while a rather interesting design, this tank just wouldn't work in game, as practically every tank it would encounter would be immune to its fire, while in turn being an extremely tough tank to take down, making it impossible to balance. Moving on to the Matilda 2A12, we currently have the Mark IIA Star or Matilda 3 variant in game, and honestly there isn't a lot of difference between the few other variants of this tank, With the initial Matilda II having AEC diesel engines and a coaxial Vickers machine gun, Matilda Mark II having a Bisa coaxial machine gun, the already in-game Mark III replacing the AEC engines with Leyland engines, the Mark IV having slightly improved engines, and the Mark V having an improved gearbox. So while in theory all of these variants could be added, they wouldn't really add much to the game, so it would have to be a very low priority. However, there was at least one Matilda fitted with what looks like a Cromwell turret, though I have also seen some suggestions that it is from the Cavalier, and this turret appears to be fitted with the excellent 57mm 6-pounder gun. The new turret and gun would give some advantages and disadvantages, with the 57mm gun having a greater penetration than the Matilda's existing 2-pounder gun, this being 82mm versus 52mm with AP shells at 500m, but the 40mm gun has access to an APHE shell, causing much greater damage after penetration. The turret would also be less protected than the Matilda's existing turret, with the current turret having 75mm of armour all around, while the Cromwell's is only 64mm at the front, 51mm for the sides and 44mm for the rear. Lastly, as there isn't much documentation on this vehicle, I'm unsure if the turret actually fits in the Matilda's turret ring. So like with the Panzer IV turrets mounted on the Panthers that I've covered in a previous episode, this might only work as a tank destroyer, though like I say I can't confirm one way or another. Lastly, the crew would likely stay at 4, and the speed might be impacted by the addition of the new turret, but not drastically so I would think. In game this could be added at 3.0 like the Valentine 9, as the Matilda would now have a more powerful gun but slightly worse armour, while still being quite slow, and I think this would be a very unusual Frankenstein tank to have in game. So now we move on to the Valentine tank, of which we have 3 variants in game. The original Mark I with the 40mm 2-pounder gun, the Mark IX with the 57mm 6-pounder gun, and the Mark XI with the 75mm gun. So 3 out of 11 major variants. Of course, the reason for only having these is again the fact that they often had very minor changes. For example, the Mark II simply replaced the original AEC petrol engine with a slightly less powerful AEC diesel engine, potentially marginally decreasing its manoeuvrability, but not much else. But then you get variants like the Mark III that have a new 3-man turret fitted, which is quite an improvement as the previous and subsequent Valentines only have 2-man turrets, for a total of 3 crew, meaning these vehicles are far easier to knock out via crew losses, while losing just 1 crew member means all weapon related jobs are left to 1 man, decreasing their performance, so by adding an extra crew member we now have 4 crew in total, slightly reducing these risks. I have also seen some sources stating that the side armour was reduced from 60 to 50mm, though I haven't found any confirmation on this, and the main armament is still the 40mm 2-pounder gun. I could see this being added at 2.3, maybe 2.7 at a push, giving us a slightly more survivable variant of the initial Valentine tank, while still maintaining most of the advantages of the Mark I. 536 Mark IIIs would be built, with New Zealand converting 18 to carry a 76mm howitzer over the 2-pounder gun, but this can only penetrate 10mm of armour in game with HE shells, so probably couldn't be added. The following Mark IV was essentially the Mark II, but with a new American GMC 6.71S diesel engine and Spicer gearbox, barely improving manoeuvrability, while the Mark V is the Mark III, but fitted with a new engine and gearbox as well, so again barely any change. Then the Mark VI is just the Mark IV but made in Canada, but after the first 100 were built, a lot of the riveted armour was replaced by cast armour, while the 7.92mm Bisa machine gun was replaced by a 30 cal Browning. The Mark 7 and 7A were again not really changed, the Mark 7 just being a Mark 6 with a new radio, while the 7A had very minor changes like protected headlamps, auxiliary fuel tanks and studded tracks, so again very minor changes. The Mark 8 was supposed to be a variant with the 57mm 6-pounder gun, but was never built due to being inferior to the already in-game Mark 9. While the last major not added variant is the Valentine 10, which is essentially the Mark 9 but with a coaxial machine gun added, as this was removed from the Mark 9, and some were fitted with a more powerful GMC engine, making this a far superior Valentine to the Mark 9. So would be a very good contender for being added to the game, probably at 3.0, while the last variant, the 11, is already in game. So as we can see, there are still plenty of Valentine models to add, particularly the Mark 3, 5 and 10, which all seem to be improvements over existing variants already in-game, and I hope to see some of them added at some point in the future. Moving on to the next infantry tank, we have the Churchill tank. And once again, while we already have quite a few variants, these being the 1, 3, NA75 and 7, this is still only 4 out of 12, so quite a few more still need adding, but like with the Valentine, these variants often don't add much, with the Churchill Mark II just being a Mark I with the hull-mounted howitzer replaced by a machine gun, which could be represented in-game by a modification to the existing Mark I, though there is at least one Churchill Mark I or Mark II that does have both weapons but in opposite places, so the 40mm gun is now in the hull and the howitzer is in the turret. And this would have to play much like a tank destroyer due to the anemic anti-tank capabilities of the howitzer, while the Mark IV, the most numerous of the Churchills, is just the NA75 in its original state, with a British 57mm 6-pounder gun instead of the American 75mm gun. Though I'd still like to see it represented because, like I say, it was the most numerous of all of the Churchill tanks. However, getting to the Churchill Mark V, we have a variant that is essentially the Mark IV, with some very minor turret changes, and is now armed with a 95mm howitzer, capable of firing a heat shell with a penetration of 110mm, which gives it far better armour penetration than the NA75's 75mm gun, and not much worse than the Churchill 3's 6-pounder APC-BC shell, while also carrying HE and smoke shells. However, its HE shell only penetrates 10mm, so only good enough for against soft-skin vehicles, and its lower muzzle velocity compared to other guns will make aiming this at longer ranges a more difficult prospect. That said, it could be added in-game at around 3.7 to 4.0, giving British players a good heavy tank for glow-scene engagements, while not being overpowered due to the shorter-ranged nature of the weapon. We then come to the Mark VI, one of the rarest variants, which is fitted with a new lower profile cupola, applique armour plates of 20mm thickness for the sides, the quick-firing 75mm gun as used on the later Churchill tanks, and raised frontal periscopes, while some sources also mention additional protection around the turret ring. This could probably be added at 4.3, bridging the gap between the Churchill 3 and the Churchill 7, giving some minor improvements over previous Churchill vehicles, though the 75mm gun doesn't perform as well as the 57mm 6-pounder. The next major variant we will look at is the Mark VIII, which is essentially just the Mark VII but again fitted with a 95mm howitzer. And this is an interesting variant as the armour is now 152mm thick for the front, and of course the 95mm howitzer's heat shell has far greater penetration than the 75mm gun of the 7. So in theory this should perform much better than the in-game Mark VII, perhaps at a better rating of 4.7 to 5.0, with the weapon's lower muzzle velocity balancing the tank's performance a little bit. This then brings us to the last three variants, the 9, 10 and 11. And these are a bit weird to cover because according to David Fletcher's book Churchill Infantry Tank, the 9 and 11 don't actually exist. Basically, there was an idea of upgrading older Churchill models with the heavier turrets from the Churchill 7s, with the 9s to be armed with 6-pounder guns, the 10 with the 75mm gun, and the 11s with the 95mm howitzer. But this required a full rebuild of the tank to take the new turret, so doesn't seem to have been carried out for the Mark 9 and Mark 11, though maybe prototypes were built, while at least 33 Mark 10s were converted, with one still existing in India. There were also plans to upgrade them without the heavier turrets, these being the light turret or LT variants, but these are basically the same as the Mark 4 through 6 variants, with applique armour attached to improve protection. In theory, the Mark 10 could be added as it was actually built, maybe at 4.7 as an event vehicle, while I don't think the Mark 9 and 11 should be added, as like I say, it doesn't seem like they were actually built. The LT versions could also be added in theory, but again, I don't think they would play any differently to some of the earlier versions, so could probably be skipped. In real life, the Churchill was eventually developed into the Black Prince, fitted with heavy 152mm of armour and the 17-pounder gun. But ultimately, both infantry and cruiser tanks would be supplanted by a new design, the A41 heavy cruiser tank, which of course became the Centurion, and as mentioned earlier is generally more famous for its role in the Cold War. However, before we finish off with the Churchill, we have a rather unique variant of the Mark III that was fitted with the Ardea Aggie mortar. This was intended as a potential replacement to the Churchill AVRE, which was fitted with the Petard mortar and was capable of firing a 12.7kg projectile up to 91 metres, with an in-game penetration of 64mm, causing a massive amount of damage but requiring the tank to get very close to the target. The Ardea Argy mortar, on the other hand, was a massive weapon with a calibre of 241mm and 3 metre long barrel, and was capable of firing a 24kg projectile up to 410 metres, a far greater distance than the Petard. It was also technically a recoilless gun, as at the same time the explosive projectile was fired, a counterweight of sand was fired out of the rear of the gun, in theory cancelling out the recoil. In order to fit the mortar into the Churchill Mark III turret, the turret had to be altered quite drastically, with part of the turret front and roof removed in order to fit the mortar. Then a new mantlet would be installed to cover any openings, while a hole was installed at the rear of the turret for firing the counterweight, though this could be covered by a sliding panel. Other than that, the rest of the stats are the same, though elevation and depression of the gun are much reduced due to the mortar having to stay aligned with the hole at the rear of the tank in order to fire the counterweight. But I could see it working in game as a premium or event tank, probably at 3.0 or higher, giving us a far more effective British demolition tank than the Churchill AVRE, and it would be nice for this rather unusual and not well known design to be included in War Thunder. In real life the design was not adopted, primarily due to issues with the limited depression and elevation, while if the turret was fully depressed, there would be an unprotected opening 8 inches long and 15 inches wide, not to mention firing a massive counterweight of sand towards friendly troops, which was somewhat considered a risk. And then to top it all off, while the gun itself could be reloaded in the turret, the counterweight couldn't, reintroducing one of the risks from the Churchill AVRE, so the project was ultimately cancelled as a result of all of these factors. So having looked at the British cruiser and infantry tanks, we'll round off this episode by looking at a British amphibious tank, namely the medium tank AT-1. And this is basically an amphibious chassis fitted with the Covenanter turret, and came in a few variants, the original variant not having suspension, while the Star and 2-star had different suspensions and gearboxes and not much being known about the 3-star variant. And overall, this looks like a pretty normal tank in the water. However, out of the water you can see this is a rather ungainly tank for use on land, being 3.3 metres tall, 7.3 metres long and 3.9 metres wide, making this a rather large and obvious target for enemies. Armour was to be a maximum of 40mm thick, so not the best protected tank in the world by any means, but it is armed with a 40mm 2-pounder gun, meaning it is at least able to deal with most enemies it will meet. The top speed is a bit confusing, as it actually had a regular gearbox and an auxiliary gearbox given a high and low ratio. The former only intended for use on water, where it would have a top speed of 5 miles per hour, but theoretically given a top speed on land of 20 miles per hour. But in reality the low ratio is used on land to avoid damage, given a practical top speed of 10 miles per hour. But this might be ignored in War Thunder, given a decently speedy tank on land. The first variant of this tank also had no suspension, which wouldn't be great off-road, but subsequent variants did have suspension fitted and they could be added if needed. Lastly, it had a crew of 5, 3 in the turret plus a driver and what is termed an extra hand, whose role was basically to do with the ballast tank carried on the tank. I could see this being added to War Thunder at 2.7, giving British players a rather unique looking amphibious tank, and I could see this being a popular tank in game, if only due to its unusual looks. Ultimately the AT-1 would be redesigned a few times, as the AT-star, 2-star and 3-star, incorporating suspensions and different gearboxes, but ultimately it wasn't adopted for service. There were also attempts to create amphibious Crusader tanks by fitting pontoons to either side of the tank, and this could be added in game to give us an additional British amphibious tank, though it would make the tank less useful when moving about on land, and again it wasn't adopted for mass service. Ultimately Britain ended up adopting the duplex drive or DD system for amphibious tanks, where an amphibious screen is erected around the tank, and these were famously used on Sherman tanks on D-Day, but were also tested on Tetrarch and Valentine tanks. However, these would likely be unsuitable for adding in game, as while this system allowed for amphibious tanks that could still fight well on land, when on water the flotation screen is so large that it completely obscures the turret and gun, making it impossible to use the armament when on water, which will probably cause some frustration when destroyed by enemies on land with no way of firing back, unless it's made that you can shoot through your own flotation screen, which again might result in players sinking themselves by mistake, So we'll just have to see if Gaijin considers those tanks for adding in the future. So that's it for this extremely long video looking at British tanks that I'd like to see added to War Thunder, and I'd be interested to hear your views on them and any others I may have missed. I will of course cover British armoured cars and self-propelled guns at some point in the future, but we'll probably cover American or Soviet tanks next, though this might change depending on how things go. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno and I'll see you next time.